6 days later, the dusty main street of Copper Springs buzzed with unusual activity. Word had spread throughout the territory that Territorial Marshal James Crawford would be hearing a formal complaint brought by an Apache woman against prominent white ranchers. People had come from miles around to witness what many considered an impossible spectacle. Maria stood outside the courthouse in her finest dress, a beautiful combination of traditional Apache beadwork and white woman's fabric that her grandmother had made for special occasions. Her split lip had healed, but the bruise on her cheek was still faintly visible, a reminder of why they were all gathered here. Jake Morrison stood beside her, wearing his best clothes and a determined expression. Over the past week, they had worked together to gather evidence and convince witnesses to testify. It hadn't been easy, but they had made progress. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house had agreed to tell what she saw, partly because Bull Thompson still owed her money, and partly because she had been impressed by Jake's respectful approach when he asked for her help. Young Billy from the livery stable was nervous but willing to speak the truth, especially after Jake promised his family would face no retaliation for his honesty. The three Apache brothers sat their horses at the edge of town, visible to everyone but not directly involved in the proceedings. Their presence sent a clear message. This was not just about one woman seeking justice, but about preventing a larger conflict that could engulf the entire region. Marshal Crawford was a weathered man in his 50s with gray eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for fairness that stretched across 3 territories. He had listened to both sides present their opening statements, and now it was time for testimony. Bull Thompson sat at one table with his 2 companions and a lawyer from the territorial capital. They looked confident, almost smug, clearly expecting that no white jury would take an Apache woman's word over theirs. But Marshal Crawford had already made it clear that there would be no jury in this proceeding. As territorial marshal, he had the authority to hear cases and make binding decisions on matters that affected territorial peace and security. "Miss Maria," the marshal said in his gravelly voice, "please tell the court in your own words what happened on the afternoon in question." Maria stood up, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. She had practiced this moment over and over. But nothing could have prepared her for the feeling of standing before a room full of white faces and demanding justice. "I was in town to buy supplies for my family," she began. "I saw 3 men corner Jake Morrison outside the general store. They were angry because he trades fairly with my people instead of cheating us like others do. They called him an Indian lover and threatened to beat him." Bull Thompson's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is hearsay and speculation about my client's motivations." Marshal Crawford waved him quiet. "I'll decide what's relevant, counselor." "Continue, miss." Maria took a breath and went on. "When I saw they were going to hurt him, I stepped between them." Bull Thompson's fist was already moving toward Jake's face. "It hit me instead." "And what happened after that?" the marshal asked. "Sheriff Davis came and lied about what he had seen. He said I had attacked Bull Thompson, even though his office window faces the wrong direction and he couldn't have seen anything. He threatened to put me in jail." "Objection," the lawyer said again. "She's accusing a law enforcement officer of perjury." "Noted," Marshal Crawford said dryly. "But given that Sheriff Davis has mysteriously found urgent business in the next county and isn't here to defend his version of events, I'm inclined to hear other perspectives." This drew murmurs from the crowd. Everyone knew that Sheriff Davis had left town as soon as he heard the marshal was coming to investigate the incident. Jake was called to testify next, and his account matched Maria's exactly. He spoke clearly and confidently about how Maria had protected him, how the sheriff had lied, and how Bull Thompson had struck an innocent woman who was only trying to prevent violence. Then came Mrs. Henderson, her gray hair pinned back severely and her voice sharp with indignation. "I saw the whole thing from my porch," she declared. "That Thompson boy and his friends were looking for trouble, and they found it when they picked on young Morrison. The Apache girl tried to stop them, and Bull Thompson hit her right in the face. Coward's act, if you ask me, hitting a woman like that." Billy from the livery stable was nervous but clear in his testimony. At 17, he was old enough to understand the importance of telling the truth, and young enough to be brave about it. "I seen it all happen, sir. Just like they said. Miss Maria tried to help Mr. Morrison, and Bull hit her for it. When it came time for Bull Thompson and his companions to testify, Their stories were full of contradictions and obvious lies. They claimed Maria had attacked them first, but couldn't explain why 3 grown men would have needed to defend themselves against one unarmed woman. They insisted Jake had been the aggressor, but couldn't explain why he had no injuries while Maria clearly did. Marshal Crawford listened to it all with growing skepticism, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed more inconsistencies in their account. Finally, he called for closing arguments. Bull Thompson's lawyer made a predictable speech about the unreliability of Indian testimony and the need to maintain law and order. But his words rang hollow against the weight of consistent witness testimony and physical evidence. When it was Jake's turn to speak on Maria's behalf, he stood up and faced the packed courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, "this case isn't really about what happened to Maria and me 6 days ago. It's about what kind of territory we want to live in. Do we want a place where might makes right and the strong can abuse the weak without consequences? Or do we want a place where all people, regardless of their race or background, can expect justice and fair treatment?" He paused, looking around the room at the faces of settlers, ranchers, townspeople, and the Apache warriors visible through the windows. Maria could have let those men beat me and said nothing about it. Instead, she put herself in harm's way to protect someone who was being treated unfairly. That's the kind of courage and decency we need more of in this territory, not less. Marshal Crawford nodded approvingly and then delivered his verdict. "Based on the testimony I've heard today," he announced, "I find that Miss Maria acted to prevent an unprovoked assault on Jake Morrison, and that Bull Thompson struck her in the course of committing that assault. I therefore order the following. Bull Thompson and his associates will publicly apologize to Miss Maria and compensate her family for the injury and insult. Additionally, the Thompson Ranch will enter into a formal agreement to share water and grazing rights with the local Apache bands, to be negotiated in good faith within 30 days. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. It was more justice than anyone had expected an Apache woman to receive in a white man's court. But Marshal Crawford wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he said, raising his voice to quiet the crowd, "I'm issuing a territorial order that any further violence between settlers and Apache people in this region will be met with military intervention. Both sides have shown today that justice is possible when people of good faith work together." As the crowd began to disperse, Maria felt Jake's hand on her shoulder. "We did it," he said quietly. "Justice actually won." Maria looked out the window at her 3 brothers who were nodding approvingly at the outcome. Nalnish raised his hand in a gesture of respect toward the courthouse, acknowledging that the white man's law had this time served their sister fairly. "Yes," Maria said, touching her healed lip and thinking of all the events that had brought them to this moment. "We did it together." Outside, the sun was setting over the red rocks of the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It had been a long journey from that dusty street where she had taken the blows meant for a cowboy, but it had led to something neither of them could have imagined, a new understanding between 2 peoples who had been enemies for too long. As Jake walked her to where her brothers waited, Maria realized that sometimes the most important victories were not won with weapons or violence, but with courage, truth, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it meant taking the hardest path of all. The idea of trial by combat hung in the morning air like storm clouds gathering over the desert. Maria watched Jake's face as Nalnish explained the ancient custom, how disputes between tribes were once settled by champions fighting on behalf of their people, with the winner's version of truth becoming law for all involved. "You're talking about a fight to the death," Jake said quietly, his blue eyes steady despite the gravity of what was being proposed. "Not always to the death," Key corrected, "but to surrender or defeat. The loser's people must accept the winner's judgment of what happened and what justice requires." Hastien stepped forward, his young warrior's blood clearly excited by the prospect of combat. "I will be our champion. I have never lost a fight, and this white man's death will restore our sister's honor." "No," Maria said immediately, moving between her youngest brother and Jake. "There will be no fighting. No one dies for what happened to me yesterday." But Nalnish was studying Jake with new interest. "Do you accept the challenge, Morrison? Will you fight for your version of the truth?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from one brother to another before settling on Maria's desperate face. She could see him weighing options, calculating odds, trying to find a path through this that didn't end in bloodshed. "There's a problem with your challenge," Jake said finally. I'm not just fighting for my version of the truth. I'm fighting for your sister's honor too. And she doesn't want this fight to happen. This unexpected response caught all three brothers off guard. They had expected Jake to either accept the challenge out of pride or refuse it out of cowardice. They hadn't considered that he might refuse out of respect for Maria's wishes. A woman's wishes don't matter in affairs of honor, Hastings said dismissively. Jake's eyes flashed with anger at that statement. They do to me. Your sister risked her safety to protect mine. The least I can do is listen to her now. Maria felt a surge of gratitude toward Jake, but she also knew that refusing the challenge would be seen as cowardice by her brothers. They needed another solution, something that would satisfy their need for justice without requiring anyone to die. What if there was a different kind of contest? She suggested hesitantly. Something that didn't involve weapons or bloodshed? Nalnish frowned. What do you mean? Maria's mind raced as she tried to think of alternatives. The old stories tell of other kinds of challenges. Tests of skill, endurance, wisdom. What if Jake proved his worth in a way that didn't require fighting? Key shook his head. This isn't about proving worth. This is about justice. Someone struck our sister and someone must pay. Someone already paid, Jake said firmly. Your sister paid when she took the blow meant for me. I won't dishonor that sacrifice by adding more violence to it. The conviction in Jake's voice seemed to give Nalnish pause. The big Apache warrior had seen many men face death, and he could recognize true courage when he heard it. Jake Morrison wasn't afraid to fight. He was choosing not to fight for reasons that went deeper than fear. You would really refuse combat to protect our sister's wishes? Nalnish asked. I would, Jake said without hesitation, even if it means you think I'm a coward. Hastings laughed scornfully. All whites are cowards. This proves nothing. But Key was looking at Jake with new eyes. Wait, he said slowly. There's something else we should consider. If Morrison is telling the truth about what happened in town, then our real enemies are the Thompson men who actually struck Maria. Why are we talking about fighting him instead of them? This observation struck home with all of them. Maria could see her brothers beginning to realize that their anger had been misdirected. Jake wasn't their enemy. He was potentially their ally in seeking justice against the real culprits. Because fighting Morrison would be easier, Nalnish admitted grimly. The Thompsons have a whole ranch full of armed men. They have the sheriff on their side and most of the town. Fighting them would mean war, not just combat. Maybe that's what it takes, Hastings said fiercely. Maybe it's time for war. And how many of our children would die in that war? Maria challenged her youngest brother. How many of our elders? How many innocent people on both sides would pay the price for your pride? Jake stepped forward again. There might be another way. What if we could get Bull Thompson to face justice without starting a war? How? Key asked skeptically. Jake looked thoughtful. The territorial marshal is due in town next week for the quarterly court session. He's not like Sheriff Davis. He's fair and honest. If we could present our case to him with witnesses. What witnesses? Hastings demanded. The only people who saw what happened were other white. The ancient meeting place lay in a clearing surrounded by towering red rocks that had witnessed countless seasons of conflict and peace. Maria and Jake arrived just as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. The circle of stones that marked the sacred ground was still intact, though weeds grew between them now and few people remembered their original purpose. Maria's heart was pounding as she dismounted from her horse. She had left a carefully worded message for her brothers, telling them to meet her at the old place if they wanted to understand the full truth about what had happened in town. She just prayed they would come alone and not bring a war party with them. Jake tied his horse next to hers and checked his rifle one more time before setting it aside. They had agreed that weapons would only make the situation worse, but old habits died hard when facing possible death at sunrise. Are you sure about this? Jake asked quietly, his blue eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs for any sign of movement. No, Maria admitted. But it's better than letting them surround your ranch with no chance for explanation. They didn't have to wait long. The sound of unshod hooves on rock announced the arrival of the Apache warriors before they appeared. Maria held her breath as three riders emerged from behind the red rocks, their faces painted with white and black stripes of war paint, their weapons clearly visible even though they remained sheathed. Nalnish rode in the center, his massive frame making his horse look small beneath him. Key and Hastings flanked him on either side, their dark eyes fixed on Jake with unmistakable hostility. All three brothers dismounted with fluid grace, their movements controlled but ready for violence at any moment. Sister, Nalnish said in Apache, his voice carrying across the clearing like distant thunder. Why have you brought our enemy to this sacred place? Maria stepped forward, placing herself between Jake and her brothers as she had done in town the day before. He is not our enemy, brother. That is what I came here to tell you. He is white, Key said flatly. That makes him our enemy, and you defend him while your face still carries the bruises from his people's fists. Jake cleared his throat and stepped forward, speaking slowly in the few words of Apache he had learned. I want to speak. To explain. Hastian's hand moved instinctively toward his knife. The white man speaks our language. Is he a spy? He learned those words so he could trade fairly with our people, Maria said quickly. He has always paid good prices for our horses, never cheated us, never turned us away from the stream that runs through his land. Nalnish studied Jake with calculating eyes. So he is the Morrison we have heard about, the one who trades with us instead of shooting at us like the others. Yes, Maria said, hope rising in her chest. That's exactly who he is, but Key shook his head angrily. It doesn't matter who he is. What matters is what his people did to our sister, and what we do about it. Jake took another step forward, his hands held up peacefully. I want to tell you what really happened yesterday. Your sister saved my life. The three brothers exchanged glances. They had not expected the white cowboy to claim Maria had helped him. Speak, Nalnish commanded. But know that lies will be answered with blood. Jake's voice was steady as he began his account. I was in town buying supplies when 3 cowboys from the Thompson ranch cornered me. They were drunk and angry because I trade with your people. They were about to beat me, maybe kill me, when your sister stepped between us. She took the blow that was meant for my face. You lie, Hastian said immediately. No Apache woman would risk herself for a white man, but Nalnish held up a hand for silence. Something in Jake's voice, some ring of truth, had caught his attention. Continue, he said. The sheriff arrived and lied about what he had seen. He was going to arrest your sister for defending me. That's when she ran. She could have stayed silent and let them beat me, but she didn't. She chose to protect me even though it put her in danger. Maria watched her brothers' faces carefully. She could see doubt beginning to creep into their expressions, the first cracks in their certainty that all white men were the same. Key spoke next, his voice still hard, but less certain. If this is true, why didn't you speak for her when the sheriff came? I tried, Jake said, but the sheriff had already made up his mind. He threatened me too. Said people in town were talking about my sympathies. I would have fought all 3 of those cowboys and the sheriff too if I had to. But your sister was already running. Nalnish dismounted and walked closer to Jake, his imposing height making the cowboy look small by comparison. You say our sister saved your life. What does this mean to you? Jake met the giant warrior's eyes without flinching. It means I owe her a debt I can never repay. It means she is under my protection now, same as if she were my own blood. And it means that anyone who hurts her will answer to me. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a sacred fire. Maria felt her heart skip a beat at Jake's declaration. She had never heard a white man speak of an Apache woman with such respect and commitment. Hastian spoke up, his young warrior's pride still burning. Pretty words from a white mouth. But words don't heal our sister's face or restore our family's honor. You're right, Jake said quietly. Words aren't enough. That's why I'm here. I want to make this right. How? Nalnish asked. Jake looked at Maria, then back at her brothers. I want to ride with you to town. I want to face Bull Thompson and his men together. But not to fight them. To make them tell the truth about what happened. In front of witnesses. In front of the whole town. Key laughed harshly. You think white men will tell the truth to save an Indian woman's honor? You are more foolish than brave. Maybe, Jake admitted. But I know Bull Thompson. He's a bully and a coward, but he's not completely stupid. If he thinks he might face consequences for lying, he might choose to tell the truth instead. Maria felt a chill of fear at Jake's proposal. That's too dangerous. If you confront them in town with witnesses, someone might get killed. But Nalnish was nodding slowly, a look of grudging respect appearing in his dark eyes. The white cowboy has courage, he said to his brothers. He offers to face his own people for our sister's honor. It's a trap, Haston insisted. The other whites will side with Thompson. They'll kill him and blame us for it. Jake shook his head. Not all of them. There are some decent people in that town who saw what really happened. If we handle this right, we can make the truth come out. The sun was fully up now, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Maria could see the wheels turning in her eldest brother's mind as he considered Jake's proposal. It was risky, but it offered something that simple revenge could not: the possibility of justice instead of just blood. "There is another way," Nalnish said slowly, "an older way from when our peoples first met in these lands." Maria's eyes widened as she realized what her brother was thinking. The old challenge laws, the ancient codes of honor that had once governed disputes between different tribes and peoples, laws that some of the older white settlers still remembered and respected. "You mean," she began. Nalnish nodded grimly. "Trial by combat. Single combat between champions. Winner takes all. Honor, justice, and the right to decide what happens next." Jake looked confused, but Maria felt her blood turn to ice. Her brother was proposing a fight to the death with everything hanging in the balance, and she knew exactly who her brothers would choose as their champion. While her brothers prepared for war, Maria crept through the desert darkness toward Jake Morrison's ranch. The moon was only a silver crescent, providing just enough light to guide her steps, but not enough to reveal her movement to watching eyes. She knew these hills and valleys better than any map, having roamed them since childhood with her family when they still moved freely across their traditional lands. Jake's ranch sat in a small valley protected by red rock cliffs on 3 sides. It was good land with a reliable stream running through it, which is why her people had camped there for generations before the white settlers came. Jake had been smart to choose this place, but he had also unknowingly built his home in a location that would be impossible to defend if attacked from the high ground. As Maria approached the ranch house, she could see a single lamp burning in the window. Jake was still awake, probably worrying about what had happened in town. She had seen the concern in his blue eyes when she ran away, had heard him calling her name. He was a good man who didn't deserve to become caught in a war between her people and his. She moved like a shadow across the open ground between the scrub brush and the ranch house, her moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. At the window, she could see Jake sitting at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. His sandy hair was disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it, and his young face looked troubled. Maria tapped softly on the glass. Jake's head jerked up in surprise, and when he saw her face in the lamplight, he quickly moved to open the window. "Maria, thank God you're all right. I was worried sick about what happened to you after you ran off." His eyes immediately went to her swollen lip and darkened cheek. "How bad are you hurt? Do you need a doctor?" She shook her head quickly. "No doctor, but I need to talk to you. It's important." Jake stepped back to let her climb through the window into his kitchen. The room was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and the smell of coffee and leather. It felt safe and peaceful, which made what she had to tell him even more difficult. "You have to leave," she said without any greeting. "Tonight before sunrise." Jake stared at her in confusion. "Leave? Why? Maria, what's going on?" She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "My brothers. They saw what happened to my face. They want revenge." "Revenge against who?" "I'll tell them it was Bull Thompson and his friends who hit you. They were the ones in the wrong." Maria shook her head sadly. "You don't understand. When Apache warriors want revenge for an insult to their sister, they don't always choose their targets carefully. They see all white settlers as the same enemy." Jake's face went pale as understanding dawned. "You're saying they might come after me? But I tried to help you. I stood up for you. I know that, and I'm grateful. But my brothers, they're angry and hurt. They've watched our people suffer for years while white men took our land and treated us like animals. Today was the final insult. They're not thinking clearly." Jake sat down heavily in his chair, running his hands through his hair again. "How much time do I have?" "They're planning to ride out at midnight. It will take them a few hours to reach your ranch. You could be miles away by then if you leave now." But instead of jumping up to pack, Jake looked at her with those steady blue eyes. "What about you? If I run away and they find out you warned me, what will they do to you?" The question surprised Maria. Most white men in his situation would be thinking only of their own safety. But Jake Morrison was worried about her welfare, even while his own life was in danger. "I can take care of myself," she said. though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Her brothers would be furious if they discovered her betrayal. Jake stood up and began pacing the small kitchen. "This is wrong. I won't run away and hide while you face your brother's anger alone. And I won't let them turn me into their enemy when I've always tried to be fair to your people." "Jake, please," Maria pleaded. "You don't understand how angry they are. My brother Nalnish is like a mountain when he's angry. Nothing can stop him. And Key and Hustian will follow him anywhere. If they surround your ranch at sunrise, they won't listen to reason." "Then maybe I need to talk to them before they get that angry," Jake said quietly. Maria felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe I should ride up to your camp and explain what really happened. Maybe if I tell them the truth, about how you protected me, they'll understand that I'm not their enemy." "No," Maria said quickly. "You can't go to our camp. They'll think you're scouting for an attack. They might kill you before you can explain anything." Jake stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "Then what do you suggest? Because running away isn't going to solve this problem. It's just going to make them think I'm guilty of something." Maria felt tears of frustration welling up in her eyes. She had been so focused on warning Jake to escape that she hadn't thought about what would happen after. If he disappeared, her brothers would be convinced he was guilty and would take their anger out on other white settlers. More innocent people would suffer. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just don't want anyone else to get hurt because of what I did today." Jake moved closer to her, his voice gentle. "What you did today was brave and kind. You protected me when you didn't have to, and you took a blow that was meant for me. I won't forget that, and I won't let you face the consequences alone." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Maria shivered. Dawn was still hours away, but she could feel time slipping away from them. Her brothers would be checking their weapons now, painting their faces for war, gathering other young warriors who were eager to strike back at their oppressors. "There might be one way," she said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "But it would be very dangerous for both of us." Jake leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Tell me, what if we met them halfway? Not at their camp where they feel threatened, and not here where they feel like they're attacking. Somewhere neutral, where we could talk before the fighting starts." "Where?" Jake asked. Maria thought of the ancient meeting place her grandfather had told her about. A circle of stones in a clearing where different tribes had once gathered to settle disputes peacefully. It had been considered sacred ground, neutral territory where weapons were forbidden and words were supposed to carry more weight than war. "There's a place," she said. "But Jake, if this doesn't work, if we can't convince them to listen, then at least we'll have tried," Jake said firmly, "and we'll face whatever comes together." As Maria looked into his determined face, she realized that she had never met a white man quite like Jake Morrison. Most would have been saddling their horses and riding for the territorial capital by now. But Jake was willing to risk everything to prevent a war that would hurt both their peoples. She just hoped his courage wouldn't get them both killed before the sun rose. The campfire crackled in the center of the hidden canyon as Maria approached her family's camp. The familiar sounds of evening filled the air. Horses nickering softly, children playing in the distance, and the low voices of the elders sharing stories. But as soon as her oldest brother Nalnish saw her face in the firelight, the peaceful atmosphere changed. Nalnish rose to his feet like a mountain coming to life. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as an oak tree, he was a formidable sight even to his own sister. His dark eyes immediately fixed on her swollen lip and the bruise that was already darkening her cheek. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet, but Maria could hear the thunder building beneath the calm surface. Before she could answer, her other 2 brothers appeared from the shadows. Key, the middle brother, was the fastest runner in their tribe and could track anything that moved across the desert. Hustian, the youngest but still taller than most white men, had the sharpest eyes and could shoot an arrow through a coin from 100 yards away. All 3 brothers now stood before her, their faces growing darker as they took in her injuries. Maria's heart began to race. She had hoped to clean up before they saw her, to maybe minimize what had happened, but there was no hiding the evidence now. "Sister," Key said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Tell us who struck you, and they will not see another sunrise." Maria looked at her brothers, these three men who had raised her after their parents' death, who had taught her to ride and shoot and survive in a world that often showed no mercy to their people. She loved them fiercely, but she also knew their capacity for violence when someone they loved was threatened. "It was an accident," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "A misunderstanding in town." Hastings stepped closer, his keen eyes studying her face. "Accidents don't leave marks like that. Someone's fist did this to you." The other members of their small band had begun to gather around the fire, drawn by the tension in the brothers' voices. Old grandmother Yazi clicked her tongue disapprovingly when she saw Maria's injuries. While the younger warriors began to murmur among themselves, Nalnish knelt down in front of his sister, his massive hands gentle as he tilted her face toward the firelight. "Maria, you have never lied to us. Don't start now. What happened in the White Town today?" Maria closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. She knew she had to tell them something, but she was determined to keep Jake's name out of it. "There was a fight," she said slowly. "Some cowboys were drunk and angry. I got caught in the middle of it." "Which cowboys?" Key demanded immediately. "What were their names? I don't know all their names. One was called Bull Thompson." The three brothers exchanged dark looks. They knew the Thompson name well. The Big Thompson Ranch had been responsible for driving several Apache families from their traditional hunting grounds, and old Samuel Thompson had once boasted that the only good Indian was a dead one. "Thompson," Nalnish repeated, his voice like grinding stone. "We know this family. They think they own the desert because they have more cattle than sense." Hastings was already moving toward where their weapons were stored. "We ride tonight. The Thompsons will learn that there are consequences for striking an Apache woman." "No," Maria said quickly, jumping to her feet. "You don't understand. It's more complicated than that." But her brothers were no longer listening to her words. They were listening to their warrior's blood, which sang for vengeance. Around the fire, other young men of the band were nodding in agreement. The insult to Maria was an insult to all of them. "There were witnesses," Key said grimly, "white witnesses who will tell the cavalry what happened. They will be expecting us to retaliate." "Then we don't disappoint them," Nalnish replied. "But we choose our target carefully." Maria felt panic rising in her chest. She had to find a way to redirect their anger away from any action that might hurt Jake. She knew that if her brothers rode out seeking revenge against white settlers, they wouldn't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Their pain would make them strike at the nearest target. "The sheriff was there too," she said desperately. He threatened to put me in jail." This information only added fuel to the fire. Hastings' eyes blazed with fury. "They would cage our sister like an animal?" "Listen to me," Maria pleaded. "If you attack anyone now, the cavalry will come. They will hunt us all down. Is revenge worth the lives of our children? Our elders?" Old grandmother Yaji nodded approvingly at these words. "The girl speaks wisdom," she said in their native tongue. "Hot blood often leads to cold graves." But the brothers were past the point of listening to wisdom. 3 years of watching their people pushed further into the margins, 3 years of insults and broken promises, and now this, their beloved sister struck in the face by a white man's fist. Nalnish stood and began giving orders. "Key, check our horses and weapons. Hustian, find out how many men we can gather by midnight. I want to know exactly where the Thompson Ranch is located. And I want to know who else was involved," Key added, his dark eyes fixed on Maria. "Sister, you said there were other cowboys. I want their names." Maria's heart sank as she realized her brothers were serious about riding out. She tried once more to reason with them. "What if I told you that there was one white man who tried to help me? One who stood up to the others?" Nalnish paused in his preparations. "What white man would risk himself for an Apache woman?" I don't know his name," Maria lied. "But he tried to stop them from hitting me. Then he failed," Hastings said coldly. "Good intentions don't heal split lips." As her brothers continued their preparations for what they clearly intended to be a raid of vengeance, Maria slipped away into the darkness. She had to think, had to find a way to protect both her family and Jake Morrison. The desert night was clear and cold with stars scattered across the sky like scattered cornmeal. She thought about Jake's ranch, isolated and vulnerable in the valley below the mesa. By sunrise, if she couldn't find a way to stop them, Her giant Apache brothers would be surrounding his home with war paint on their faces and weapons in their hands. Jake would wake up to find himself trapped in the middle of a conflict he never wanted, paying the price for his kindness to her people. Maria looked up at the stars and made a silent promise. She had taken the blows for the cowboy today. Tomorrow she would find a way to take the war away from him too. The dust swirled around Maria's bare feet as she ran through the desert scrub, her long black hair streaming behind her like a war banner. Behind her, she could hear the angry shouts of the white settlers growing fainter with each desperate step. Her dark eyes burned with tears she refused to shed, and her lip was split from the blow that had started it all. She had been in town buying supplies when she saw it happen. Jake Morrison, the young cowboy with sandy hair and kind blue eyes, had been minding his own business outside the general store. He was new to these parts, had only bought his small ranch 6 months ago. The other settlers didn't like him much because he treated the Apache people fairly, often trading with them for horses and beef. That's when trouble found him. 3 drunk cowboys from the Big Thompson Ranch had cornered Jake, accusing him of being an Indian lover and threatening to teach him a lesson about proper white behavior. Maria had watched from across the street as they shoved Jake against the wooden storefront, their fists raised and ready to strike. Without thinking, Maria had rushed forward. She threw herself between Jake and the biggest cowboy, a mean-spirited man named Bull Thompson. The blow intended for Jake's jaw caught her square across the cheek instead, splitting her lip and sending stars dancing across her vision. "Leave him alone," she had said in clear English, though her voice shook with both fear and anger. "He has done nothing wrong." Bull Thompson's face had turned red with rage. "A dirty Apache defending a white man? You got some nerve, girl." The crowd that gathered began to murmur and point. Some looked angry, others curious. Jake had tried to step forward to help Maria, but she had pushed him back with surprising strength. "Go," she whispered to him urgently. "Go now before this gets worse." But Jake Morrison was not the kind of man to abandon someone who had helped him. He stood his ground, his own fists clenched, ready to fight all 3 cowboys if necessary. That's when Sheriff Davis arrived, his hand resting on his gun. He was an older man with gray whiskers and cold eyes who had no love for the Apache people. "What's all this commotion about?" he demanded. Bull Thompson pointed at Maria with a thick finger. "This Indian girl attacked me, Sheriff. I was just talking peaceful-like to Morrison here when she came at me like a wildcat." Maria felt her heart sink. She knew how these things went. The word of 3 white cowboys would always be believed over hers. Jake tried to speak up to tell the truth of what had happened, but the sheriff held up his hand for silence. "I saw the whole thing from my office window," the sheriff said slowly. "And what I saw was an Indian girl causing trouble in my town." The lie hit Maria like a physical blow. The sheriff's office window faced the opposite direction and couldn't possibly see the front of the general store. But none of that mattered now. "She needs to be taught some manners," Bull Thompson said with a cruel smile. "Maybe a few days in jail will remind her to stay on the reservation where she belongs." Jake stepped forward then, his young face flushed with anger. "That's not right, Sheriff. She was defending me from these men who were about to beat me for no good reason." The crowd began to murmur louder. Some nodded in agreement with Jake, but others shook their heads disapprovingly. Maria could see the division her presence had caused. She had made things worse for Jake, not better. "Boy," the sheriff said to Jake in a warning tone, "you'd best be careful about the company you keep. People in this town are starting to talk about you and your sympathies." The threat was clear. If Jake continued to defend her, he would face consequences too. Maria couldn't bear the thought of bringing more trouble to the kind cowboy who had always treated her people with respect. Before anyone could stop her, she turned and ran. Her moccasined feet carried her swiftly through the dusty streets as angry voices rose behind her. She could hear Jake calling her name, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Now, as she ran through the familiar desert landscape toward the hidden canyon where her people lived, Maria's mind raced. She thought about Jake's kindness, how he had always paid fair prices for their horses and never cheated them in trades, how he had learned a few words of Apache to communicate better, how he had defended their right to use the stream that ran through his property when other settlers had complained. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert rocks in shades of red and gold. Maria knew she had to reach her family before dark. Her 3 brothers, tall and strong Apache warriors, would be angry when they saw her split lip and heard her story. They had always been protective of their only sister, especially since their parents had died in a cavalry attack 2 years ago. As she climbed the narrow path that led to their hidden camp, Maria tried to think of a way to tell them what had happened without mentioning Jake's name. She knew her brothers well. If they learned that white men had struck her, they would want revenge. And if they discovered that other white men were planning to hurt Jake Morrison, the one cowboy who had always been kind to their people. Maria shivered despite the warm desert air. She had taken the blow meant for Jake today, but she feared that by morning her giant Apache brothers might be the ones delivering blows of their own. The thought of Jake's ranch surrounded by angry warriors made her stomach twist with worry. She had tried to protect him today. Now she had to figure out how to protect him from her own family's desire for justice. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of a storm on the horizon. Maria quickened her pace, knowing that by sunrise everything might change forever.